morning. Welcome to Kanishka. Today, we will try to understand what PSIR or Political Science and International Relations as an optional and how to score at least 300 plus in this particular option. Because PSIR is essential in two ways. One, PSIR is important because it deals with most of the contemporary issues that dominate both the economy as well as society. And in this context, because in the past, as we all know, the economy was regulated through a planned economic development. And second, post 1991, there is a clear shift. There is a clear shift towards market economy. So, what is the role the state has played both in terms of this pre and post? So, if you have to score the best marks or highest marks, what is needed essentially with respect to this political science and international relations is, because as many students may not be aware, and definitely students who have taken political science as one of their optionals at the graduation level may feel a little more comfortable. But it does not dissuade others from taking this optional. So what is essential in terms of this particular paper is, this paper is very dynamic, very contemporary, and which has its influence on all the other four papers, particularly with respect to the history, geography, which is part of the PS paper 1, GS paper 1. Then we have the GS paper 2 exclusively to deal with the constitution and governance, social justice, then followed by international relations. Third, we have economy, science and technology. Then we have this internal security, which is again a part of this study of the political science. Then finally, ethics in administration. Ethics in administration more or less again deals with the philosophers who presented their concepts in terms of understanding what an ethical society should be. So we have a long tradition that is created from the Greeks onto the present. So everywhere you find the influence of this paper in all these four general studies. And apart from this, the paper itself has two papers, political science and international relations, as it is popularly known. Political science paper 1 has two parts, one dealing with the essential concepts as well as the thinkers, both Indian as well as Western. I think this is something which is there with every paper, and this is where the central understanding of the whole paper comes. If you have grip over part A or paper 1 part A, then probably I think it would be a smooth sailing to understand the other papers as well. So focus on the part A, and part A, it comprises of the different concepts, and you don't find multiple number of concepts. There are very limited concepts that you have to handle. Though it starts with the definite approaches, what is a method that is followed and what are the approaches that are necessary to study polity or political science, then followed by the major concepts of the political science. Here we have the nature of state, and here this is where I wanted you to focus on, because with respect to the concepts, starting from the state, the concept of state, and the concept of rights, the concept of equality, the concept of democracy, and the concept of power, authority, and hegemony, they are all essential not only to understand political science in particular, they are also essential in terms of understanding the polity's relationship with both society and economy. This is what I wanted to convey when I started with my first sentence stating that polity has a definite influence both on state and society. Then how do you score? Here you have to remember two things. The simplest way to understand this paper in particular is categorization. That means you have to split the historical time frame into two. One, in terms of this 1991, which has actually resulted in a major tumultuous, I might say tumultuous. Tumultuous means grave changes that have occurred in 1990s. So we have to understand this relationship in terms of this shift that has taken place, because 1990 heralds a major shift in international relations, a major shift in the understanding of the subject. So if you have this grip, because 1990 heralds the actual beginning of the globalization phase. So if you have grip in terms of this particular compartmentalization, in terms of understanding the polity and its significance prior to 1990 and post 1990, your understanding of the subject becomes much more easy. Otherwise, these concepts are essential, but they are both theoretical as well as particular, because most of the concepts, if you try to look at the paper as such of the polity, most of the questions, they are definitely related to the concepts, but in terms of its application. So how do you generalize a concept to a particular understanding? So usually the UPSC pattern of question setting is, they do not usually focus more on particulars, because here there is another problem that you also have to understand. Because whatever opinion that we shape, that may differ. There is nothing like an objective reality in terms of understanding the state. If there was only one single understanding of the state, then there was no necessity to study different theoretical conceptions of state. Because we try to understand state in various theoretical conceptualizations like liberal state or Marxist state or feminist state. So when we say there are different dimensions or different understandings a particular concept has, that shows that there are different opinions. So these opinions vary from one person to another person. So whenever you answer this particular paper, part of your answer becomes subjective. That means you will be heavily influenced by your own subjective opinions, the way you understand the subject. So this we cannot avoid it, because otherwise it would be a memorization. So avoid memorization. If you want to avoid memorization, then what is essential is to understand the concepts the way you understand it. So it is as good as anybody else understanding, because all these social sciences, we do not have any objective truth, because truth itself is subjective, because the opinion that we establish also ranks similar to the opinion of others. So what is essential to our understanding then is this particular emphasis in terms of justification of our opinion. If I construct a opinion, then I need to justify my opinion is also equally right. So here I may have to refer at least one or two thinkers, one or two political thinkers whom I understood in order to shape my understanding or opinion of the paper. So this is where you have to focus on. So focus on understanding the nature of state, both in terms of its pre-globalized era as well as post-globalized era, because then you can better understand the major shifts that have taken place in terms of understanding the concept of a state or the theories of state. So even with respect to liberal state, what was a liberal state, or what is a liberal state? What is a liberal democratic state? Does liberal and democracy mean the same thing, or is there any distinction between liberal and democratic, and what sort of a distinction they are? And secondly, what are the challenges? What are the challenges to the liberal democracy that we confront today? So this is where you have to have some opinionated, I repeat, some opinionated, that means some opinion in terms of your understanding of the state or the concept of state, both in terms of the liberal democratic principles or in terms of the Marxist understanding of the state. Then we have this, the liberal democratic assumes both pluralistic as well as neoliberal state. So there won't be any much confusion until unless you don't try to understand from its root what a liberal state stands for. So try to understand the historical significance in terms of the evolution of a state and in terms of its progress towards realizing what purpose. So these are the things that you have to focus on. So if you, in terms of your categorization of history, then examine what was the nature of state, whether the state is a natural institution as advanced in the works of the ancient Greeks, or state is something artificially created which emerged in the writings in terms during the Enlightenment phase. So here, having come to Enlightenment in terms of understanding this paper and to make it high scoring, this is another important breakthrough that you have to also focus on, because pre-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. So this is another categorization that you have to focus on. One is pre-Enlightenment and second is post. So post-Enlightenment and pre-Enlightenment, this Enlightenment phase you also come across both in history and then we have this pre-globalization and post-globalization. This is sufficient. This is more than sufficient. If you can understand this paper in terms of this categorization, that means pre and post. Why pre-Enlightenment? Because pre-Enlightenment, the understanding of the state was completely different. The understanding of the state was more particular with respect to obligations, the obligations of the citizens towards the state. It emphasized more on the art of governance rather than with the people concerned. But post-Enlightenment, there is a shift in terms of understanding the nature of the state, because the state is no longer perceived as something which is natural, but something which is artificially created. This major shift that the post-Enlightenment thought has brought in is also very important to understand this paper, because this shift has laid certain foundations for the understanding of post-Enlightenment thought. And this foundation relied on three major aspects. One, the foundations of Enlightenment thought relied on three interesting pillars. They are, one is science, because the Enlightenment thought is heavily influenced by the writings of scientific explorations. Second, it was the dominance of reason and rationality, because something which is revived as part of Renaissance literature. And third, it emphasized on the idea of progress. So these three are the strong foundational pillars on which this paper is built. So your understanding of this paper is essentially to make a focus and maintain a clear distinction in terms of this pre-Enlightenment thought and post-Enlightenment thought. And accordingly, once you move from this position to the present, to the contemporary understanding, then we can compartmentalize them in terms of this state which is based on planned economic system and a state which is based on market economic system. So here, Enlightenment thought focused on ushering in change in terms of our understanding with respect to society, and globalization has brought a major shift in terms of understanding the economy. So these two have heavily influenced and got influenced. So polity influenced both society and economy, and in the process it also got influenced by both economy and society. So this is a multidisciplinary approach, or there is some sort of a interdependence between these three concepts. So whenever you understand any concept in terms of this polity, what is essential is to understand it in terms of its pre-enlightenment phase and post-enlightenment phase, and subsequently how it has impacted both the pre-globalized era as well as over the globalized era. So this is something what you have to focus. If you can have grip on this, if you have a grip on this foundations of understanding, then I think your scoring in this paper will be relatively very high. So remember this, both paper 1 and paper 2 constitute on the concepts that have evolved in terms of the pre and post enlightenment. Second, the distinction that it tried to maintain, or the identity that it tried to maintain in terms of this globalized era. So this is the central understanding of this paper assumes significance. So if you are aiming to score high, more than 300, then it is essential to have a grip on the basic understanding, of the essential concepts like what is a state, what is public life, what is a private life, and what constitutes a private life and what constitutes a public life. Whether the state can dominate into your private life or the state is only limited to your societal existence. So similarly, in order to understand this, what we acquired is the rights. So how essential are these rights in understanding or in limiting the power of the state, and also in enhancing the freedoms of the individuals concerned. So this is another dimension. So what is the objective or what is the purpose behind the existence of the state? If you read Aristotle's statement, he argues that state comes into existence for the sake of life and continues to exist for the sake of good life. But now today we are in the midst of a major pandemic which is life-threatening. Now this COVID pandemic in fact has raised many concerns, whether how far we justify the existence of the state when the state cannot guarantee life. This is another fundamental question, because it is not only the Aristotelian understanding that state comes into existence for the sake of life and continues to exist for the sake of good life. Even the social contractarian tradition which has evolved during Enlightenment, the social contractarian tradition which has evolved during Enlightenment also laid emphasis on the existence of state for self-preservation. This is what Hobbes taught. Thomas Hobbes' understanding was state was essential for self-preservation, and in the present, in the 2020, the state has failed in either way, because it failed to protect the quality of life as Aristotle envisaged, or it failed to preserve the self-preservation as Thomas Hobbes understood. So this is where the legitimacy of the existence of state is also questioned. So you may also expect a similar question with respect to the increasing role of state in dominating your life because of this public health emergency, we find two identical aspects with respect to the state. One, it has empowered the state to be more surveillance state. Surveillance means where the state also intervenes into your private life today, right? Because of the health emergency, the state acquired immense power to regulate the society, wherein it can enter into your life, household life, in terms of maintaining the social distancing or wearing of this protective mask. So all this amounts to that the state having encroached or developed into a surveillance state. At the same time, it has negated its responsibility of self-preservation, because every loss of human life is to be accounted by the state, because according to the understanding of both the ancient Greek thought or the post-enlightenment, the essential duty of the state is self-preservation. And if it fails to do this, then what does it signify? Are we moving towards an authoritarian state? Are we moving towards an authoritarian state globally, which has discarded its duty to self-preserve the individual, or what is the significance of holding these rights against the state? Because if you see, there were many protests. There were many protests that were launched. Particularly in America, which was opposed to this encroaching role of the state. They were opposed to the enforcement of lockdown. They were opposed to the imposition of certain restrictions in public life. So this shows that there is some active citizenship which is trying to challenge the authoritarian state in most parts of the world. And it does not mean that state should not intervene, because definitely during a public emergency, what is public, especially with public health emergency, what is essential is the state having a very active role, a positive role in instilling confidence within the people, and at the same time protecting the life of the people through increasing health surveillance mechanism, right, and protecting the life. So this is something how you have to understand. That means there will be definite questions based on the pandemic, because it is a global phenomena, a global pandemic, which has altered the relationship between the state and the individual across the world. So this, where it has shifted, how this relationship was perceived under the Greeks, and how this relationship is understood in terms of post-enlightenment literature, and how this relationship has flourished in the globalized era, and how the pandemic has openly identified the failure of both state and society, the failure of both state and market, in anticipating a public health emergency, or in properly addressing a public health emergency. So this is a major failure. It is a major failure with respect to the technological changes that are brought in under the globalization era. So this is where we have to focus on. So if you are understanding with respect to a concept, if it is linked to the contemporary issues, then your scoring will be very high. So don't ever limit yourself to the understanding of a particular thinker or a particular concept only to its rudiments, but you have to also practice in terms of improving your understanding of the concept to the present contemporary issues. So this is where the significance comes. So this is where the power of the state or the authority of the bureaucracy or the authority of the bureaucracy that dominates. Another interesting thing is the question of bureaucracy. This is part of the governance that is also which is very essential to understand, because what is so significant is the post or during this globalization, even the nature of governance which is developed into a debureaucratized governance, or deregulated governance as far as economy is concerned, but it has become a highly regulated state in terms of society is concerned. Because this deregulation or debureaucratization is only limited to the economic dimension, not to the whole society. Why we claim this is because of the increasing authoritarian role as far as society is concerned. The state is only limited in terms of its interference only with respect to the economy, not with respect to the society. Because what is so significant is globalization has also brought in another important concept. One, it laid emphasis on the economic globalization, but it also parallelly developed cultural nationalism. So these two things are combined into one. This is where the success and failure of globalization is reflected. On one side, globalization advanced economic globalization. That means it promoted a borderless economy, or in terms of geography, it represents end of geography. But it's, as far as cultures are concerned or cultural identities are concerned, it laid stress on identity assertion. And this is where you find the reinvention of nation state. So nation state reinvention is essentially based on the renaissance of culture or revival of culture. So in the past, this was not the feature. This was not a feature because culture always remained latent. But under globalization, culture is playing a very dominant role. So this is also you have to understand if you have to score high marks in this paper, because the nature of questions that appear partly focus on these two. One, your understanding of the pre-enlightenment phase and your understanding of post-enlightenment phase. Similarly, your understanding of the concepts in terms of both the planned economy and as well as the market economy. So if you maintain a clear distinction in terms of the understanding of different concepts like the rights, the concept of state, or the concept of power, the concept of authority, the concept of hegemony, or the concept of equality, or the concept of democracy, all have undergone tremendous change in the pre as well as post-enlightenment phase, and thereafter during the pre-globalization and globalization era. So these are two historical landmarks. These are two historical landmarks which help you. If you have a proper grip in terms of understanding the paper in terms of these two, then I think your understanding of the paper is well and truly as intended by the Union Public Service Commission. So the exam pattern reflects these changes, though they are major, but there are also subtle changes. There are again subtle changes within that anyway you will get acquainted once you start reading this paper. So what is essential to understand is this paper 1. In paper 1, particularly the part A, if you have grip in terms of using these concepts in terms of the historical framework that I give, then your scoring in this particular paper is relatively very, very high. Thereafter, not only the concepts, because as I said, concepts acquire different meanings. So we have to develop some sort of a opinion with respect to each and every concept. Once you develop one opinion, one particular opinion, say liberal. So if you have a liberal understanding of the state, then you know what is not liberal. What is not liberal. Similarly, if you have a particular understanding of state in terms of Marxist, then you know what is not Marxist. So when you have the opposite also, that means you will try to understand the essential features of a concept only when you know what the concept is not. So this is how it becomes very easy for you to not only acquire grip over the particular concept, because as I said, there are not many, right? The concept of state, the concept of rights, the concept of power, authority, and the concept of hegemony, or the concept of democracy. Then we have a list of the Western thinkers who have argued either in favor or against of these established concepts. It is not something completely different. So starting from Plato, Aristotle up to Hannah Arendt, we don't find much difference, because there is always a continuity in terms of understanding these essential concepts. So remember the historical framework that you have to register in your mind in terms of both the pre as well as post Enlightenment phase, and also the pre-globalized era as well as the globalized era, to address the concerns or to address the challenges that dominate in the present. And this, if you can understand this part, I think you succeed in at least having this paper or having gained confidence in this paper by more than 50%. Rest are all particulars which you have to generalize. See, UPSC never anticipates any question with respect to particulars, because particulars always come with subjective opinions, and this subjective opinion may differ from person to person. So UPSC always focuses on universalizing or generalizing a particular understanding, and this is essential. So what is that you need to know about this paper 1? So what I suggest is, don't go for hi-fi readings. Don't go for, the authors which become complicated. Try to put it simple. Try to put it simple. So what is needed here is to understand the essential concepts. So read any standard book. Read any standard book starting from NCERT. Then you can move to the IGNOU material as far as the concepts are concerned, as far as to understand the concept of concepts are concerned. As I said, when you focus on state, you should know the various theories that have come in terms of theoretical understanding of the state, whether liberal, neoliberal, Marxist, pluralist, or the feminist theory. Similarly, when you want to deal with power, you should know what is power. What is the understanding of the power as expressed by the sociologists like Weber, or as expressed by a sociologist like Karl Marx, or as expressed by post-modernists like Foucault. If you can maintain these three distinctions, these three understandings between Foucault, Marx, or postmodernist, or the modernist, or the tradition, then your job is done. So every concept you have to understand in terms of all three aspects. One, the traditional; second, the modern; and third, the contemporary. And this makes very simple to understand. So once you have confidence in this, then concepts, then with respect to Indian and Western thinkers, I suggest Indian reading to start with. You can always go, or you can always rely on Telugu Academy book for Indian thought, because it is something which is recommended for the graduation level teaching at the university level. So you have a better option in terms of choosing the Telugu Academy book written for the graduation level in terms of the graduation final year students, that is Indian thought as well as the Western thought. So Indian thought, you have this concept of dharma and danda which have emerged subsequently, which got transformed in the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, who replaced not just dharma, the understanding of dharma, but he also brought in the understanding of satya to replace dharma. So his understanding of dharma was not based on danda or violence, but his understanding of dharma was situated in terms of understanding satya. So satya is something which can be practiced both by the individual as well as by the collective. This is where a shift that Gandhi brought in, and this is where he laid more emphasis not on danda but in terms of non-violence. Truth and non-violence remain central to the understanding, and you can expect a definite question on this. So here also, with respect to Indian thought, there is a continuity from the Vedic phase up to Gandhi, and Gandhi brought a major shift. So this, if you can identify, then you can easily write this paper, right? So any question based on this, because Indian thought is more based on spirituality, whereas the Western thought is dominated by materiality. This is the simplest difference, because material thought, this Western thought, especially the post-enlightenment Western thought, is heavily dominated by the material life of society. And that is the reason why you find vast changes shaping the thought and shaping the life of the people. So we find the rise and spread of this industrial revolution, which is one of the primary reasons for the success of this Western thought. So we find this, and whereas Indian societies did not move to the extent the Western societies developed, because we relied excessively on spirituality. Spirituality means without any materiality, and this is where the major shift that we find in terms of both Indian and Western thought. Indian thought is dominated by spiritual nationalism, whereas Western thought is dominated by material nationalism. If you can understand this, then you can also find a sequence in terms of Plato, Aristotle to Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is a beautiful exception, because Hannah Arendt is so critical about the nation state, because the all-pervasive nation state which experience today is something which is severely criticized by this Jewish refugee who remained as a refugee in America for more than 13 years. Her life experience is beautifully helped us in understanding the limitations of the nation state. So this is where it culminates, because it is a sequence that is followed in terms of this understanding. So if you can follow this, then I think this is easily a high scoring paper once you have grip on the paper 1 and particularly part A. So remember, certain concepts, they are essential to have read through the NCERT, and to get a finer understanding, the IGNOU conceptual understanding is the best. And as well as the thought is concerned, Indian thought, the Telugu Academy is more than sufficient even for Western thought, but I also suggest to include Sukhbir Singh. Sukhbir Singh, it is a two-volume book that has come with respect to the Western thought, starting from the Greeks to Marx. So it comes in 2 volumes, and that is also, I think, is something which is advisable, because it is simple, lucid for non-political science graduates to have some understanding, some fair understanding with respect to the part A of paper 1. Remember, the more the grip you acquire on part A, the easy it becomes for you in order to understand and respond. Then with respect to part B of paper 1, it includes mostly the Indian nature of the Indian nationalism, thereafter the features of Indian state. And this actually coincides, this to a large extent coincides with the paper 2 in GS, because the evolution of constitution, the Indian federation, Indian parliamentary democracy, then we have this constitutional bodies, statutory bodies, and that is all part of the paper 2. Then the formal and informal organizations, party democracies. Then we have also one of the aspects of economic development, which essentially dealt with the state interference into economy. State interference into economy. Here the literature is very large, and I leave it to your understanding, but at least one basic reading of essentials like Jyoti Basu or D.D. Basu is essential to have a clear understanding of the Constitution. One reading at least of D.D. Basu is sufficient for paper 2. Then with respect to the nature of Indian nationalism, many students, in fact, they read Bipan Chandra, but Bipan Chandra does not give you a clear-cut understanding. But here, I suggest to read Partha Chatterjee. Partha Chatterjee's article with respect to the nature of Indian nationalism, an article which you find in Oxford, India, because Oxford, India, it's a compiled Oxford University publication which has come on India. It's a compiled edition. You find articles being contributed, and among them, Partha Chatterjee's article, particularly with respect to the nature of Indian nationalism, is a highly enlightening, not only in understanding the national movement, but also it gives you an edge in understanding the nature of Indian nationalism. So remember this. For rest of the thing, I think D.D. Basu is sufficient, but most students limit it to reading guides that I don't suggest. What is needed, at least when you are taking an optional, you have to read at least one standard book with respect to the Indian Constitution, and that is more than sufficient. Then the party system, you have Johansson writing in terms of politics in India or inclusive politics, but even newspaper articles is sufficient as far as party system is concerned, or the nature of pressure groups in India, because of late we see a transformation in terms of the activities of the pressure groups, something like the Occupy movements that dominate us, like the Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Shaheen Bagh. So there are examples, or Occupy Hong Kong Central. They are all examples of the changing nature of citizen activism or people's activism against the state in terms of its policies, particularly these policies which promote this corporate during this globalized era. So these are the essentials that if you can understand, I think your scoring will remain very, very relatively very high. Then with respect to paper 2, it is always argued that the first part of this paper 2, first 4 sections or first 4 topics deal with the comparative politics. So how to understand comparative politics? We have 2 dominant approaches. One is the political sociology approach, and the other is political economy approach. And either of them is used in terms of comparison. First of all, you should know why we should have a comparison. Why we should have a comparison. With respect to comparison, we have dominant theories which have become part of this behavioral movement of 1930s and 1940s. A major shift is brought post-enlightenment in terms of this. During enlightenment, the shift was in understanding the abstract laws, like understanding the physical laws, because enlightenment phase was dominated by the writings of Newton, Copernicus, Galileo, and this behavioral movement is dominated by the richness in the development of biology. So this behavioral movement in fact advanced this interdependent interconnectedness. So we have a different framework which helped in the promoting theories like systems theory or structural functional analysis in terms of having a comparison with respect to different states and societies. So this is where the focus remains. Then we have theories to identify the state in the capitalist and socialist state and the various theories that have developed to understand them. Here also in international relations, you have to focus on understanding the root, particularly with respect to the liberal state. What does the liberal state stand for? Once you ask this question, so liberalism believes in equality, fair equality. So the basis for this liberal state in comparison is equality among all states. And not only equality, it also believes in the existence of supranational states, supranational institutions like United Nations to maintain peace and cooperation. So essentially, it is dominated by this concept of equality. Then we have this Marxist understanding of international relations, which are grounded in terms of hierarchy, because Marxism believes in the hierarchical class relationship between the property class and propertyless class. Then we have another dominant theme in international relations, that is realism, which is grounded in anarchy. Anarchy means lawlessness, because most of the international active politics are understood in terms of this anarchy. Anarchy means lawlessness. That means self-help system or each state trying to promote its own national interest through national power and trying to realize its national interest with the help of national power. So these concepts have led to the rise of another concept like balance of power, whereas liberalism promoted collective security and realism promoted balance of power, and Marxism promoted hierarchical state relationship between core and periphery. And whereas another recent trend which emerged in terms of understanding international relations is the identities that are created in terms of the post-behavioral. So we find the postmodernist or the post-feminist or the post-structuralist, they all focus on establishing and asserting the identities. This is where the globalization era also coincided. So you have to understand these thinkers or these theories in terms of the basis that I try to highlight. That means try to understand liberalism in terms of equality, and within the liberalism we have another offshoot of liberalism, that is realism, which promotes anarchy, and then we have Marxism, which is grounded in hierarchy. Then we have another aspect, that is the post-behavioral, that is grounded in identities. So if you have understanding based on this, your writing the paper is very simple. So you have to correlate the contemporary issues like an issue of Afghanistan. How will you answer the situation in Afghanistan from the realist perspective, from the liberal perspective or idealist perspective, or from Marxist perspective, or from the identity perspective, that is the post-behavioral perspective or the contemporary perspective. So you take one example, take one issue and try to relate it in terms of these four, whether in terms of equality, whether in terms of anarchy, whether in terms of hierarchy, or whether in terms of identity. Once you practice identifying the contemporary issues in terms of these four distinct, then you don't need any major book to read on, to fall back on, because even the foreign policies are shaped by these concerns. So try to acquire grip in terms of these four major principles: equality, hierarchy, anarchy, and identity, and try to relate them try to relate them with the contemporary challenges. Then your understanding is highly appropriate, and wherein it helps you in scoring very high marks, because paper 2 is understood to be a very high scoring over paper 1. So the focus that you should lay is in terms of understanding this comparison. So to understand this comparison, IGNOU material is more than sufficient to understand these concepts, but you can also have a good reading in terms of this, particularly with respect to there are many books, not one in particular, but if you want to have lay some stress and emphasis, then we have to also focus on understanding in terms of Baylis and Smith. Baylis is a wonderful book with respect to understanding the essential concepts in international relations. And you can also fall back on Andrew Hayward, because Andrew Hayward focused on globalization or the impact of globalization. And here Andrew Hayward helps only to those students who are already acquainted with some understanding of the concepts. For a new student, it becomes a little difficult. So I leave it to them and start reading newspaper analysis. And newspapers, you should focus both on Indian Express as well as Hindu, because Hindu is known to have some soft corner towards left-leaning intellectualism, whereas Indian Express has some soft corner towards right-wing politics. So if you want to create a balanced understanding, it is essential to read both Indian Express as well as Hindu. I think you don't have to go through the whole paper. You can be very selective with respect to all those articles which dominate the present contemporary issues or crises in terms of international relations. So as far as books are concerned, then this is limited. Then we have David Mellon and Srinath Raghavan with respect to the Indian, because paper 2 part B deals with Indian concerns and India's neighborhood relations, India's extended neighborhood relations, India's diaspora. Then we have Indian foreign policy, determinants of Indian foreign policy. Then we have India and the developed world and India and the developing world. And India's concern with respect to global institutions and India's respect with respect to global concerns, because globalization has advanced this. Prior to globalization, the world was divided in terms of hierarchical interest. Hierarchical interest means where there was a demand for new international economic order that is raised by the developing world. But globalization has in fact helped in overcoming this hierarchy, and it promoted horizontal interest. And this stress on horizontal interest is what has resulted in developing a consensus with respect to climate change, or with respect to human rights regime, climate change regime, or nuclear proliferation regime. So we are experiencing all this WTO regime. So we find some sort of a horizontal consensus or horizontal understanding that is promoted in terms of globalization. So pre-globalization, you have a different understanding which is hierarchical in nature, and globalization has advanced a different understanding which is horizontal in nature. And this is where you try to identify all those challenges to the global order as global commons, or challenges which impact as part of the global issues. So we have counter-terror regime, global non-proliferation regime, climate change regime, human rights regime. So we have these regimes which are considered as part of a consensus which reflects this horizontal interest. So remember, so this becomes even more easy for you to score in terms of this paper. So once you understand the nature of these regimes and how it has promoted some sort of a understanding. Clear? So we have moved from hierarchical needs to horizontal needs as part of the globalization. And it also, as I said, in the context of India, we created global institutions. So these global institutions in general has led to a new understanding, because as we started with the NAM, that means non-alignment. From non-alignment, we moved to multi-alignment. So what went on in terms of shaping our foreign policy? Why India has moved from non-alignment to alignment, from alignment to again non-alignment, non-alignment to realignment, realignment to multi-alignment. So what is that influence, this nature of Indian, both the domestic as well as external relations, which helped in establishing these multi-alignments? This is where, say, the significance comes. So India, which began as a state which was not primarily concerned with what is happening externally, because initially we focused more on continental security, but in the present we moved from continental security to maritime security. So this is where the changing equations or the changing dynamics that compelled India to move from from a reluctant power, as we started in terms of non-alignment, to an engaged power. Engaged power wherein we have aligned with, on one side with America in terms of the Quad with respect to promoting our maritime security, and also the other side we still stick to this non-alignment too with respect to our global south. So this global north versus global south, as it has emerged, it promoted the creation of multilateral engagements and multilateral arrangements. Our multilateral arrangements, particularly with respect to the rising global south in terms of BRICS, in terms of BASIC, in terms of IPSA, or in terms of the G20. All this is also very important, because we are no longer limited only to the functioning of the United Nations. So there is a compelled reason to promote multi-alignments across. So in terms of practicality, we are moving towards multi-alignment. In terms of theory, we are at the same time we are promoting this multiple modernities. Multiple modernities means we are no longer trying to imitate the model of development of the Western societies, but we are more comfortable with respect to our own understanding of progress, our own understanding of growth. So we are trying to chart our own course of progress. So this is where each society, however traditional they are also recognized as some sort of a modern societies. So this try to erase the distinction that was created in terms of this comparative analysis based on tradition versus modernity, and we have moved in terms of recognizing more and more traditional societies as modern societies. So it is not one monolithic modernity that we have, but instead we have multiple modernities where every state in comparison is identified to have attained some level of modernity. Clear? So theoretically, the emphasis is more on this existence of multiple modernities, and empirically it resulted in the creation of multiple alignments. So there is a clear shift from non-alignment to multi-alignment, which dominate the foreign policy analysis. So if you have understanding of this, what I gave you, I think your scoring in particularly in paper 1 and paper 2 stands relatively very, very high. Very, very high. Thank you.